Good morning, everyone. Happy to see you online for this webinar, Value of Water in Canada. My name is Roy Brouwer, host of the webinar series here at the Water Institute, University of Waterloo. I'm going to give people a little bit of time to log on. We have a large number of registered participants again today, and we're very happy to have a dual presentation from the Great Lakes and Cities initiative. I'll introduce the speakers in a moment, just giving people the time to log on before we start the webinar. So as said, welcome to the webinar. I see names that have participated in previous events, so I assume everything is clear. We'll have a presentation, and if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A box to enter your questions, and then we'll get to your questions at the end of the presentation. Before we start, I want to acknowledge also that I participate today from the traditional territories of the Nuto, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. Our campus of the University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract that you can see here in the map. It's the land that was granted to the Six Nations, including 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within the Indigenous Initiatives Office here at the University of Waterloo. And I invite you to briefly reflect on the land from which you are participating today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers of today. Phil Murphy-Rhéaume. He is the Chief Development Officer at the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, which is a binational coalition dedicated to the protection and restoration of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River Basin. Phil plays a key role in advancing the organization's mission with a focus on fostering sustainable development, environmental resilience, and economic innovation. He leads efforts to enhance partnerships and implement strategic initiatives that benefit the region's municipalities and stakeholders. Phil's expertise includes building collaborative relationships and driving projects that address critical environmental and water-related challenges. We also have his colleague here, Max Hayet. He's the Canada Policy Manager for the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, where he represents the interests of Ontario and Quebec mayors within the Alliance. Max has a background in policy evaluation and a passion for transport and urban planning. He thrives at the intersection of participatory approaches, research, and green policy making. Known for his curiosity and people-centered approach, he excels in engaging citizens and stakeholders to advance sustainable practices that enhance urban resilience and protect vital freshwater resources across the region. And today, Phil and Max are going to share with us the programs that they run in the Great Lakes Cities Initiative, St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. I'm very happy to have you here, Phil and Max, and I'm happy to hand over the floor to you.
Thanks, Roy. And I'll just take a second to share my presentation. Hopefully it's working for everyone.
Great.
Perfect. Well, good afternoon, and thank you to the Water Institute for this opportunity to present as part of the Value of Water series. I hear that it's the last one of the series, and we're truly honored to be part of this ongoing series of informative discussions and dialogues. Today, our presentation will focus on, of course, our work at the Cities Initiative, but also looking at the opportunities and challenges for Fresh Coast Cities. And we'll get into detail or do a deeper dive by what we mean by Fresh Coast Cities, and looking forward to the discussion. So without further ado, I'll continue. As Roy said, I'm Philip Murphy-Rhéaume, Chief Development Officer at the Cities Initiative, and I'm joined by my colleague Max Hayet, who's our Canada Policy Manager. Today, we'll be providing you an overview of the Cities Initiative, some of the public policy challenges our member cities are facing, with a particular focus on the Canadian side. And we've also reserved time at the end of our presentation for questions. And so please feel free to quiz us, grill us, and dialogue with us on some of the issues that may be of interest to you, your work, and your research. To begin, we'll start with a quick 101 on the Cities Initiative before doing a deeper dive on the city or the issues that cities in the Fresh Coast are facing. And so the Cities Initiative is and we usually we understand that the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative is a mouthful. So we shorten that, thankfully, to the Cities Initiative. So we're a multinational coalition of municipal and Indigenous government executives. We're focused on the sustainable development of our communities. And our organization was founded just over 20 years ago in 2003 by Richard M. Daley and David Miller, who were then the mayors of Chicago and Toronto, respectively. The vision behind the creation of the Cities Initiative was to give voice to municipal governments when it comes to the management and protection of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River, but also to bring together towns and cities that share a common geography, common history, common economy, as well as common challenges. Since our formation back in 2003, our coalition has grown to over 260 members from across the region. So as you'll see, our membership covers all 8 Great Lakes states and both provinces in the basin. Our membership also stretches from Duluth, Minnesota to the west, or Thunder Bay on the Canadian side, to Rimouski, Quebec. And since last year, we've also begun expanding our membership to include Indigenous communities in the region, again, recognizing that there's opportunities to work collaboratively to address some of those water quality challenges we're facing, water equity challenges, environmental justice challenges that we're facing in the region. And we have expanded that relationship with Indigenous communities and are continuing to do so through a program that we call the Turtle Island Scholarship, which provides them with a complimentary membership to the organization. In terms of our mission, the Cities Initiative is focused on promoting economic prosperity in our communities, but also protecting the freshwater resources that underpin our region's success and capacity for growth. So you see that we're active both in Ottawa, in Washington. We also engage provincially and at state governments where appropriate. In terms of our work and our approach, we provide programming to our members to support results across the region and results on the ground. We also unite cities to advocate for the solution and resources they need to address common challenges. We provide connection to cities with experts to collaborate and ensure that they have the tools to make the right decisions around the issue areas that we cover, and we'll get to that shortly. And we also provide a platform to educate our members on best practices and practical solutions. We largely do that through our own webinar series, as well as through our annual conference. And I'll be making a plug for that upcoming event at the end of the presentation. In terms of our areas of focus, or what we call our strategic pillars, these pillars are focused on outcomes that we are looking to achieve through our work. And they're tied to the principles of sustainable prosperities at the community level, as well as freshwater protection. Again, understanding that our region's success, both in past, present, but also in the future, is tied to the health of our aquatic ecosystems in the region. And so it makes sense for one of our key pillars to be focused on healthy lakes and rivers. And closely tied to that, we talked about access to clean and safe water. And the way that I usually like to talk about these two different pillars is healthy lakes and rivers is what takes place offshore and nearshore. And then when we talk about safe and affordable water. It's that onshore interaction of water. So how our communities, how our infrastructure pulls water and then puts it back into our systems, which, as you well know or probably know, then has also impacts on our water quality. Through our work, we also strive to strengthen climate and coastal resilience at the community level. And finally, we're working extensively to promote economic transformation in our region. This is a new area of work that my colleague Max will be covering in the second part of our presentation. Now, in terms of some of the recent accomplishments that the city's initiative was able to contribute and played a role in securing, we were part of an active coalition that successfully pushed for the creation of the new Canada Water Agency, as well as pushing for record investments in Great Lakes protection on the Canadian side as part of the strengthened freshwater action plan. So for the first time in over a decade, the Canadian government is more or less matching what the US federal administrations are putting into Great Lakes protections, of course, with a few elements of relativity. So it's not a one-to-one match, but essentially from a population and pollution standpoint, Canada is at the table in terms of investments in protecting those freshwater resources. We also helped put pressure on the Quebec government to increase royalties on industrial water users in the province, which then led to the creation of a $500 million Blue Fund to support freshwater initiatives in Quebec. We have also been working through the Climate Proof Canada Coalition to land the country's first national adaptation strategy. And now that that strategy has been announced, to ensure its effective implementation and also continuity as we look at upcoming elections on the federal side and making sure that the next federal government also puts priority on adaptation measures. We've also been vocal on the needs for federal and provincial governments to invest in water infrastructure. Over the last year, making the tie to a common goal across all of governments to increase housing starts and increase housing accessibility, understanding that without the water infrastructure, the capacity to accommodate that growth and construction will never be able to meet those targets. And then finally, on the American side, definitely want to do a special call out to our work around advocating for the Brandon Road Lock and Dam project in the Chicago area to keep invasive carp out of the Great Lakes. This has been a major gain on the US side, along with continued bipartisan support for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is essentially the program homologous to the Canadian Federal Freshwater Action Plan. Now, despite some of the great successes over this past year and the past few years, Fresh Coast cities are facing some important headwinds that we'll be covering over the next slides. Before we dive deep into those challenges, I want to address this term of Fresh Coast, because admittedly it's not one that's been heavily socialized, but one that I'm quite personally a fan of, and that we're helping to push through at the city's initiative. But essentially, the Fresh Coast was a term popularized by the past mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, to distinguish the Great Lakes coast from other marine coastal regions, while also calling attention to the economic dynamism of the region, its importance. We also liken this region as the heart of North America. So we have a strategic maritime corridor that can bring goods and resources from the Midwest or American heartland to key Canadian provinces, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean and across the world. It's also a mean of moving away from a term that's been used a lot, especially on the American Midwest, of talking about the Rust Belt, which when you use that term, signals an irreversible decline. The Fresh Coast signals more of a positive or optimistic viewpoint on what the region contributes and its potential as a region to further grow and to be resilient in the face of a changing climate. Now, you may have also seen a lot of these stats, but we always like to cover them just to represent the scale to which the Fresh Coast is at the heart of North America. So the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River Basin contains over 20% of the world's surface freshwater. It is a source of drinking water for over 40 million Canadians and Americans. On the Canadian side, 80% of Ontario residents live in the basin, while 60% of Quebec's population lives in the St. Lawrence Basin. So by some accounts, nearly half of Canada's population lives in this region. The region is also an economic powerhouse, representing between $6 and $8 trillion of economic activity. 50% of bilateral trade between Canada and the US happens in the region. And the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River or basin directly support more than 1.5 million jobs, including more than 350,000 jobs in the marine sector alone. So as you can see, the Fresh Coast is a significant and dynamic region that supports both the Canadian and American economies. So despite all these elements that make our region great, Fresh Coast cities are facing a whole host of issues, some of which we cover and deal with directly as an organization. Others build into the larger policy context in which municipal associations, coalitions like ours operate. So like many other cities in North America and around the world, Fresh Coast cities are dealing with the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, which include financial and budget struggles, the fact that their primary actors in a dual housing and mental health crisis that's impacting communities across the country, but of course in the region as well. And more broadly, a angry electorate, and we're seeing that with turnover and income in governments across the region, but around the world as well. There's just a sense of anger that is, of course, bubbling over at the municipal level, which in many cases tends to be the most accessible level of government. They're also first-line actors in terms of responding to climate impacts, and we're still seeing that the political debate is raging around climate action. And this despite the fact that we've been debating this at the political level for over a decade in Canada. We still see that there's no political consensus around climate action, which then trickles down in terms of what municipalities can do and the support that they can expect from other levels of government. With the incoming U.S. administration and our region's dependence on bilateral trade, tariffs, of course, and the discussion about the incoming administration basically triggering trade wars could have a major negative impact on Fresh Coast cities on both sides of the border. That's certainly something that we're hearing from our members and that we're mobilizing around. We've seen a lot of investments in the clean economy over the last few years, but this year particularly has been a tough year from that perspective, at least when it comes to the EV and battery markets. Again, those markets are facing headwinds, but it's a leading industry or leading industries where Canadian governments have made significant investments. And so we do have skin in the game and their success, but at least in the immediate term, those industries are facing challenges and there's no real broad outlook in terms of how things are going to turn over and whether some of those companies that have been invested in will be able to, implement the investments that they were made to make. Also, we've seen, and this also ties to our housing challenges around accommodating growth in the region. And our region has historically been one of the first places for new populations to call home. And so we're seeing struggles both from an economic standpoint, but an equity standpoint around those issues. And then finally, when it comes to changes or financing programs and resources that cities can tap into, we've seen significant deficits both at the federal and provincial levels that are coming at a time where multiple crises are hitting us, whether it's in terms of housing, healthcare, education, and now we're having other calls to action around border and defense spending, but there's little action or scope for action beyond those items. And then, despite seeing record investments, given this deficit context and push for austerity by certain circles, freshwater programming could be one of those first targets for cuts. Certainly one that we'll be pushing back against. But largely that's a broader context or policy context in which our cities and members are operating in. Now, in terms of our direct work that relate to our pillars, from a climate and coastal resilience standpoint, our region has thousands of kilometers of shoreline, and although we're not seeing the same level of weather and climate impacts that we've seen on our east and west coasts, our region is still at risk. So on the U.S. side, the scope for public action to intervene on coastal shoreline or on shorelines and enhance the resilience is the fact that 80% of that shoreline is privately owned. And on the Canadian side, despite only 20% of the shoreline being privately owned, we also find major urban centers, including Canada's two largest cities, being found in the region. And so when we see major storms, impacting our communities, we see also the devastating impacts on infrastructure, on people's homes, on housing. And so our region is particularly at risk from that perspective, just that economic and population base that is exposed to more severe and more frequent extreme weather. In fact, since 2021, severe weather has caused nearly $2 billion in insured damage in Ontario and Quebec. And nearly 1 million homes in both provinces are in the top 10% of highest flood risk in the country. So that could have a huge impact on our housing stock. And of course, given that our municipalities are dependent on property income taxes or property taxes and the value of those homes to base the property tax, there could be downstream impacts on municipal finances. And finally, our members expressed interest in adopting more green infrastructure solutions to strengthen climate and coastal resilience. That being said, there's a low level of knowledge among many decision makers and oftentimes with outside consultants with which municipalities work. So we still see a default and bias towards traditional or gray hybrid or gray infrastructure solutions. And also there's limited interventions to support climate adaptive measures on private properties. So right now there aren't a lot of incentives available to homeowners, to businesses, to climate proof their homes. And that's certainly a risk given the level of private investment, private property that exists in the region that is exposed to that weather. So in terms of our recommendations and responses to those political realities, I'll pass it on to my colleague Max to cover that aspect.
Yeah, well, I guess the general context, as Phil very well explained, is that talking about climate adaptation and coastal resilience is talking about housing. We're awaiting a report from the Climate Institute of Canada that is gonna put a figure on how many houses that and how many homes we have lost either temporarily or permanently due to flooding and wildfires. But in our case, in the region, it's mostly flooding, and we're looking at hundreds of thousands. So when we're in the context of a housing crisis, this is especially important. It's also important for safety of Canadian communities, for economic activity as well, because if your business or house gets flooded all the time, that has a draw on the economy. I think this year the figure was that it costed $7 billion in insured losses throughout the country, and most of that was due to floods. We're talking about percentage points of growth there. And also affordability, because most of Canadians' assets are in the housing sector, in real estate. So what we are advocating for is setting up a center of expertise. So basically focusing on knowledge. How erosion is well known, especially in the context of salt water, but a little bit less so in the context of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence, because there was an ice cover that was diminishing the impact of erosion. So we're advocating for more knowledge through a center of expertise that could support municipalities with technical assistance and expertise, but also Canada Research Chair on freshwater erosion to gain more of a complete and holistic understanding of the phenomena at stake. We also want to provide better insurance for Canadians. It is often the case that Canadians are not insured or cannot be insured anymore or for certain risk in certain areas, it is of the utmost importance that everyone can be covered by flood insurance. And in that case, we ask the Canadian government to step up, but also properly fund. Municipalities only collect 8 cents on each dollar on each tax dollar. So they have very limited funding. We need the federal and provincial government to step up. May it be through the Disaster Mitigation Action Fund, which is a tremendous action fund that supports local action on resilience. May it be to upgrade the water system so that they are more resilient to any floods, or set up green infrastructure focusing on preventive action. But also the shoreline funding that had been cancelled in 1997. We are asking for it to be reinstated, and we were very happy that the Tran Committee of the House of Commons passed a unanimous motion to reinstate it, a unanimous report calling for its reinstatement, but also looking at new alternative funding models. As Phil was mentioning, private property is especially on the line. And there is increased scrutiny as for what could an insurance company do to limit their losses and the losses they have to reimburse, but also for other stakeholders of the private sector that could be stepping up because the needs are huge.
Thanks, Max. Now, in terms of our healthy lakes and rivers and safe and affordable water pillars, despite levels of funding for infrastructure increasing over time, we still see a consistent rate of underinvestment by all levels of government to bring our water infrastructure back to a state of good repair. And we see the consequences of that directly. Both in Montreal and Calgary this summer made headlines with water lines failing, causing massive flooding, putting access to water at risk. From a equity standpoint, a general access and affordability standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint, our infrastructure needs to be sound for us to be seen as reliable centers for private sector investment. This summer, in consulting our members, we also heard there's a desire, to lower costs when it comes to running our water and wastewater utilities. One way that's been identified to do that is to lower consumption as a way of keeping both costs for utilities down, but rates for consumers down. That said, there's little appetite to impose new fees and taxes to reduce demand. So again, you can imagine that when a municipality is set to introduce a new fee or tax, the blowback can be swift and quite direct. So there is reticence to do that. And so, there's more interest in tinkering at the margins, if you will, and looking at other ways of identifying and repairing leaks, for example. Some municipalities are implementing what they call raw water strategies to supply water to the agricultural sector without that necessarily being treated water, because that's not a necessity. But in certain cases, that's the water that is being funneled to the agricultural sector. So despite the fact that some cities are implementing new fees or approaches, some are taking different policy and programmatic approaches to reduce consumption and hopefully bring those costs down. From a water quality standpoint, nutrients continue to pose a challenge in our waters. We're also seeing growing concerns around emerging contaminants and their potential effects on public health and municipal finances. So issues like microplastics, PFAS have been bubbling up. We're seeing more and more headlines, particularly when it comes to PFAS. That information is trickling up from the US, where that's been more of a headline issue. And finally, through that same consultation, municipalities recognize the impact of road salt on water quality. But again, there are struggles to find viable and economically feasible solutions to reduce the reliance on road salt. And with that, I'll pass it on to Max again to talk about those policy responses and recommendations.
Yes, so it's sort of a two-pronged approach. first of all, it's about making sure that the natural water resources that we have are the highest quality as possible. So that is why we're advocating for 1 billion in new funding for the Freshwater Action Plan that has been set up as alongside the Canada Water Agency, making sure that we put all the efforts on the table so that the water that is currently in the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence is already clean, so that there's no, first of all, so that the livelihood of our communities is preserved, maybe also for leisure, for transport, and for just general livelihood of the cities, but also for the treatment of the water for the water systems and for drinking water. So 1 billion in additional funding, expanding the list of pollutants that are currently monitored and tested, such as microplastics, PFAS, untreated sewage. We're hearing a lot from municipalities that this is a big issue. Very often they see the water quality of their waterways decrease significantly, but they're not sure where it's coming from. They only have some ideas, and we're not yet there that they can already know directly where that decrease in quality is coming from. Having more basin-wide programs, so having this sort of like regional consultations and initiatives that address invasive species. We've talked about the carps, invasive carp in the lower basin, but there are plenty of other invasive species that are coming through our waterways. But the second part is also infrastructure, housing, and infrastructure funding. As Phil noted, our infrastructure is crumbling. So, and the federal infrastructure funding is coming to an end and a renewal in 2026. We want to make sure that there's going to be significant emphasis on water infrastructure. Again, especially we're in a housing crisis. We might often forget it, but water infrastructure is directly linked to housing. You cannot have housing if these houses are not connected to the water infrastructure. And the water infrastructure, although not visible, is crumbling. In most cities, in Montreal, we still have water pipes that are made out of wood. That poses a problem for new development, but also for densifying the neighborhoods, even though we all know that this is most needed. So this is where we want the federal government to put a lot of emphasis to make sure that we're going to be able to live up to the challenges of this generation and the challenges of the next.
Thanks, Max. And before I pass it on to you for the economic transformation section, just want to do a special call out to our federal and provincial governments that are making investments. Of course, we're always looking for more investments that will support freshwater ecosystem health, the health of our and sustainability of our communities. But we've seen some investments from the Canadian federal government around the Freshwater Action Plan, $420 million for the Great Lakes. So we've seen funding come through the Great Lakes Freshwater Ecosystem Initiative. We also have the province of Ontario that has a Great Lakes strategy and also has funding available through the Great Lakes Local Action Fund. And so those are two publicly available funds where they do periodic calls for proposals. So those are programs that if you are working in freshwater protection, freshwater health, you should definitely keep an eye out for. And on the water infrastructure side, again, just want to call out the fact that, federal and provincial governments have been hearing what municipalities are saying when it comes to housing development being tied to having infrastructure in place to support that. And so we have seen investments that are targeted specifically around water infrastructure to help address and accelerate housing developments. So just wanted to do that call out, and give credit where credit is due from that perspective. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Max.
Yes, absolutely. I think that was a right note of nuance that we're always asking for more because the challenges are tremendous. But indeed, there's been action in the past few years, and not quite meeting the challenges yet. But we're hopeful that also through our advocacy, we're going to get there. Now, on economic transformation, the scope is a little bit different. If we can go to the next slide. We as an organization are talking a lot about the environment, and the goal of this economic transformation work is to tie all the great work that our cities are doing on the ground with the environmental protection, but also their needs for economic development. and make sure that they go hand in hand, and also encompass an element of equity, social equity there. So making sure that when our cities are advancing their climate goals, it doesn't run counter to the economic development happening on the ground, and how can they steer that economic development in a more sustainable direction. Why did we want to move in that direction? Well, first of all, because our region is the third largest economy in the world. You can see it on the screen. There's a $6 trillion that are been produced in GDP every year if in the Great Lakes region. But also because of the challenges coming from the climate crisis, with the issues of resiliency, the drain on the freshwater resources that are both an asset, but that are coming under more pressure. When I say they're an asset, it's because with 20% of the world's water resources, there's certainly a comparative advantage. And so that is why we want to help the cities take a local leadership role to make sure that they can harness these advantages and these assets in tackling the issues of the time. Next slide, please. So it's always nice to start with a good follow-up. So we passed a resolution, well, I should say our members passed a resolution. You can see on screen the mayor of Montreal in pink, the mayor of Chicago, and the mayor of Milwaukee from left to right. We passed this resolution and this pledge from, I think we're now at about 100 cities who signed on to the pledge, and all of our cities have adopted the resolution to do some work on economic transformation. Big cities, as you can see on screen, from Chicago, Milwaukee, and Montreal, but also Toronto, Cleveland, Quebec City, and Detroit are signing on to that project. But now, as we say in French in Quebec, what does it eat in the winter? What does that consist of? We dive into the next slide. So we have mapped it out as 4 priorities where municipal governments can act. Sometimes there are a bit more clear-cut for municipal action, such as waterfront transformation. So how can we create accessible, multi-use waterfronts that are drivers of economic development, but also equitable communities? I can come in and give a bit more flesh on the bones as for what each theme means. But we're also tackling industry. So how can we attract new industries that are going to leverage the water resources that we have and that are sustainable? And that can foster job creation and reduce while still reducing emissions and waste and protecting our freshwater resources, but also how to transform the current industries in a more circular economy direction for transport, because we need some transport links to link our cities. We basically want to take advantage of the seaway and all the waterborne commerce that is happening in the region, but that could be developed further. But add to it an element of mobility and within the cities, and also tourism across the cities. So how can we use our waterways so that they're not just an obstacle? I'm thinking about Lake Ontario. You know, when you're in St. Catherine, it can take you 3 hours to go to Toronto. But if you're if you could take a boat across the lake, and there are some projects for that, it could take only less than an hour. I think they came in with an estimate of 30 minutes. And also, how can we use our waterways best for tourism? The third pillar is energy. So how can cities act to transform our energy systems so that we reduce green gas emissions and support the electrification of our societies? On all these, I think if we can go to the next slide. Across all these, we're always seeing it through the lens of freshwater protection, climate action again, sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. So inclusivity being that equity part, also working with First Nations, and municipal leadership. Municipal leadership is not always clear-cut all throughout these topics, but that is why the goal of the action plan, detailed in the next slide, is to provide recommendations both for our cities, so our members, but also for the industries working in our cities, for our partners, such as the Water Institute, for research centers, consulting firms, experts, and other advocacy groups, but also for federal, state, and provincial governments. So the goal is really to map out what can cities do, what is outside of the realm of possibilities for cities to act on, and how can we leverage partnerships throughout the region to act on it. The plan will outline a vision for a blue and green economy corridor. So again, connecting this the region through transport, through energy systems, having an integrated economy as much as possible, but that is decarbonated and that is promoting freshwater stewardship and sustainable economic development. We're also going to dive into a gap analysis of what is missing currently in the current context, and actionable recommendations. This is especially important for mayors. They want to know what they can act on now, may it be for advocacy, but also direct projects in their community. We have already started to identify best practices, which we hope to turn into case studies. And then the goal is also to have some implementation and evaluation content so that we can look back and review this action plan in the coming years and see how to improve upon it. We're not developing this alone. We are aiming for a strong evidence-based research. So that is happening through the desk research we're doing internally. We have 4 working group coordinators that are, and the rest of the staff is also helping with doing some desk research so we can make sure that we're grounding our conclusions into the latest state of evidence-based knowledge. We are doing some member surveys to better understand what are they facing on the ground and whether they have some good practices that they want to promote. Stakeholder consultations. I just had an interview with the Canadian Urban Institute, but the core of it is still the working group discussion. So each working group consists of experts on the topic. May they be NGOs, but also government, private sector, academics on industry, transport, energy, and waterfront transformation. And so we have regular meetings for them to support us in our reflection for the action plan development. All throughout this, we're getting input from our mayors, our very engaged mayors in the Mayor's Commission. So again, they're meeting regularly to steer this work. We're here as a secretariat to make sure that we take note of their ideas and make them come to fruition. And so all throughout, we're going to be getting feedback from our mayors to make sure that we're actually equipping them with the right tools. We can move on to the timeline real quick. So just so you know, we're still wrapping up on the gap analysis. So you can see the drops here are when we're having mayor's commission meetings and also working group meetings. So we have them bi-monthly, and right now we have just wrapped up the discussion on the gap analysis. So looking at where we are now and where we're trying to go and what is still lacking in terms of policies. We're going to be moving into developing recommendations based on these discussions. We're going to have an initial conversation about a first draft list of recommendations, and then fleshing them out also with case studies in April. The plan is to deliver a first version of the plan at our annual meeting in Milwaukee in May. Phil is going to tell you more about that event in the coming minutes. And then after that, we plan to launch our action plan during Climate Week in New York City in September. So we would love for you if anything of what I've been saying rings any bell, we'd love for you to take part in the conversation. I can give you a bit more information about what the different priorities of the pillars may they be the industry transformation, energy transformation, transport transformation, and waterfront transformation are tackling. I know that we're running short of time, so I'll leave that for the questions. If you want more detail, I'm happy to put more flesh on the bone. But in terms of how can you take part in this effort, well, as you can see, we have had we have devised multiple ways to integrate external expertise. So if you think you have relevant expertise, we'd be happy to jump into a stakeholder interview. You can also join our working groups. We can have a discussion about that. You can also just simply send us resources via email if you think there's an interesting report. I'm sure that our email is going to be shared at the end of this presentation, so you can just tell me, Max, hey, like, there's the super useful resource coming out of Ontario on circular economy. We think that this would be really tremendous to advise mayors on how to go about circular economy in their area. And you can also offer to review our deliverable and action plan recommendations. We're happy to engage you and to carry that conversation. And I'll be looking forward to anything you have to say in the Q&A. But now, being mindful of time, I think I can pass it on back to you, Phil.
Thanks, Max. And just also want to do a call out that beyond our economic transformation work, we're always looking forward to engaging with experts, other groups who can help us identify appropriate policy solutions and or identify on the ground fixes that can provide additional context around some of those policy areas where we work that we can then present to municipal authorities. In certain cases, we've developed collaborative agreements with like-minded organizations to support that work. So, for example, this year, we've signed memoranda of cooperation with Conservation Ontario and the Council of the Great Lakes Region. We can also be an effective vehicle for advancing knowledge and policies with municipal leaders in the Fresh Coast region. So if there's if you've been sitting on a solution that you think will revolutionize the way that we manage our water, that we develop our economy, we certainly want to hear that because we may be the tool that you can use to advance that vision. And our contact info is shared on the last slide, and we'll also drop our email addresses in the chat during the Q&A so that you can get in touch with us. In terms of supporting the organization, just also want to do a quick call out that organizations that want to get more involved with us, as well as gaining benefits of building a more a deeper relationship with us. If you're representing a municipality on this webinar or an Indigenous community, you can become a member. For NGOs, educational and research institutions, we have a new Allies program, which is the form of an associate membership to the organization. And if you represent a company, we're launching what's called the Industry Leaders Circle, which is basically a business cycle. A business council that will work between municipal and private sector representatives to ground check our economic transformation work, to talk through some of those emerging issues like the Canada-US trade relationship. So a lot of ways for organizations of any shape, stripe to be able to get involved with us. And then finally, just want to do a call out because we've mentioned it a few times that our next annual conference will be taking place May 14th to 16th in beautiful Milwaukee. And our theme is around the future of freshwater leading the way in an era of scarcity. So we'll be looking at topics such as managing water consumption, improving water protection, and mitigating local flooding. We also have a special price offered for students to attend. I know that there's also the cost of getting to Milwaukee, but certainly something to keep in mind. And then you can also scan the QR code on the slide to get more information about the event on our website and find out how to register. We'll also drop a link in the website for that, and also for you to be able to sign up for our newsletter and get information directly from us. And with that, I will pass it back to Roy to moderate our Q&A session.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Phil and Max. Thank you so much for this overview. Fantastic. Happy to see that you have an MOU with the Council of the Great Lakes Region. They actually organized a conference in the summer on sustainable development of the region. We were there with a couple of students looking at circular economy. And I think one of them was actually collaborating with you as well. Yeah, so we have time. We have 10 minutes left, time for questions. So those of you that are there online, please post your questions in the Q&A box. We have one from Caroline already, Caroline Hill-Smith. And I'm just going to read it out. It's a little bit of a story. With recent Ontario provincial planning regulatory changes that download responsibility of maintaining water quality and quantity on the municipal staff as per section 4.2 of the provincial planning statement, while cutting regulatory power to conservation authorities, plus the pressure to expand beyond urban boundaries to accommodate population, how can cities and towns keep water safe when planning staff have little or no resources or expertise on hydrological processes or framework to manage chemical fate and transport like salt pollution? Phil or Max?
That is a great question. There's no short and easy answer. I think that we can look at coalitions that are building around issues. So the city's initiative is part of the Climate Proof Coalition that has been advocating and successfully got a national adaptation strategy out of the federal government. We were also part of the coalition that led to the creation of the Canada Water Agency, the Freshwater Action Plan. So I think it's bringing like-minded individuals, organizations, cities together to do a deeper dive on those issues, exchange notes on who's doing what, and then come up with an effective strategy of getting the word out, both publicly, but also with those policy decision makers. Sometimes governments have certain priorities and may have blind spots to other elements that contribute to that issue at the baseline. So we've been using a lot of that example around water infrastructure and the housing connection. So it's not one that necessarily policy decision makers may think about off the fly. But that if you tell the right story, if you make the housing connection, then they're more likely to listen, because that's the alarm bell goes off, or the light goes off of, oh yeah, we hadn't thought of that angle. Like, let's come together with solutions. And on that front, like, I mean, we meet with conservation authorities and Conservation Ontario through our MOC on a frequent basis. Admittedly, it's been around our coastal resilience work. But from a source water protection issue, we've just launched the Water Equity Commission on the Canadian side, which will be doing a deeper dive in 2025 around those source water protection issues and water infrastructure issues, because again, we see the intimate links between both of them. Max, I don't know if you want to chime in with additional context or information there.
No, it's a great question. It's I think you gave quite a comprehensive answer. I think we're carrying in that voice that municipalities cannot go it alone. We're more and more going to need a sort of like a whole of society approach to things, and building coalitions to advocate for that and making sure that there are no blind spot in government decision is especially important. It seems like one. So we're going to continue advocating for that. But I'd be curious actually to liaise on that with Caroline and to get more information, because it seems like you have a lot of feedback, and we're always happy to get more expertise and point of views to make sure that we don't have blind spots.
Perfect. Yeah. So Caroline did her master's degree here at Waterloo. She's an expert in salt. And she's also a member of the Ontario Salt Pollution Coalition, as you can see in the Q&A box. So there are lots of things going on in the chat box at the same time as well. So I see, Max, that you already shared your email addresses with the audience. There is a request for the presentation. So there's going to be a link in the chat, I think, soon, from the producer of the show, Julie Grant, to the website where you can find the recordings of all the webinars that we that we had over the last 3 years. So look out for that link. And I think Phil shared the link to the annual conference of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. So that is really great. I don't see any other questions anymore in the Q&A box. Maybe a question then from my side in the last few minutes, if I may. So, the action plan sounds like a fantastic initiative. Also, very happy to see that your gap analysis is coming soon already to an end. My initial thought when I saw that slide was you presented before that where you identified that we need $12.5 billion dollars to bring water into good repair. There was a $45 billion backlog in Quebec. So I was just wondering a little bit, what do we still need a gap analysis? Don't we know what the issue is? And isn't the issue to a large extent the availability of financial resources?
Yeah, so just to be a bit more precise, the gap analysis was on the economic transformation front, because indeed it seems like there's a lot of information out there on what the gaps are. I think it's more about how we can fill them with available resources. On the economic transformation side, I think it's the question is of the gaps are, what can municipalities do? For example, when we're talking about transport, it seems an integration between marine and land transport, it seems like there's a bit more of a patchy approach, and like that conversation has not been extended to all cities. So that is the gap analysis that we're working on. Also, I said that we're wrapping it up, but it's still going to be an open case until we publish the action plan. So if you have anything to contribute to that, I'd be happy to hear about it. But yes, indeed, like the main issue is definitely funding, and throughout the work that we're doing on economic transformation, the main issue is funding. When we're talking about transport, there's also an issue of the funding of transport infrastructure. It's not just about the water infrastructure. It's like we see a big issue in Quebec City, for example, where they want to expand the harbor, the port. But there's an issue about like how much funding is available for that. So yes, absolutely, unlocking investments. I think there's also a question about the narrative. Phil mentioned it, like how can we shape the correct narrative so that there's no blind spots? Here it's about saying like, these investments are net and critical to make sure that we increase the Canadian productivity. But going back to the sort of second aspect of your questions, which is more linked to water infrastructure. I think, yes, there's a lot of information out there, but municipal staff is often flooded with information. So it's also a question of prioritizing this information. And this is why collaborations with experts such as you and the Water Institutes and the webinars that we're doing are really a great opportunity for us to make sure that all the resources that are out there, we try to make it a bit more digestible for municipalities. And so that is also why we intend to work more and more with experts to make sure that, again, like if you have graduated from water engineering 20 years ago, it might be that you're lacking the knowledge about the latest trends. And I've talked a lot about the partnerships with the universities, but another thing that we're working on in terms of investment is how can we invest smart? And with that, we're working with water innovation incubators such as Aqua Action in Montreal, to again make sure that municipalities are aware of the latest technologies, so that despite their limited resources, they can still address the challenges they're facing in an economically smart way, while waiting for more funding, which we're of course advocating for.
Yeah, thank you very much, Max. I think we have to leave it at this. Thank you both very, very much, Phil and Max, for presenting. As Phil already mentioned, this is the last webinar of the year, but we're also going to take a pause. It's also the last webinar of the series that we have been organizing over the last 3 years. Julie included the link to the recordings of all the webinars that we have had over the last 3 years. I think it's close to 30 presentations and discussions online. I'm very, very grateful to everyone who participated, presented, and those of you who have been patiently participating online and watch the discussions unfold. Thank you all for participating. Phil and Max, once again, thanks for the fantastic presentation. Wishing you all happy holidays. And last but not least, I would like to thank my colleague, Julie Grant, who you never see, but who has been extremely helpful in producing the recordings and facilitating the event over the last 3 years. Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you all in the audience. Happy holidays and take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.